Dawn creeps over the South China skies, bleeding crimson into the horizon. The air tastes of iron and oil. Imagine yourself as a young Japanese pilot in 1941, strapping into the cockpit of your nimble Zero, convinced that your empire has already mastered the skies. The officers told you the Americans would fold like paper. They whispered that Chinese airmen were amateurs, that their machines were outdated relics. Victory was meant to be inevitable, swift, and glorious. But then, through the morning haze, you see it. A shark's mouth painted across the nose of a squat, rugged fighter. Its eyes glare back at you, mocking, daring you to strike. It is not elegant like your Zero. It is not graceful in the climb. And yet, as it roars toward you with guns blazing, you realize, too late, that you have underestimated the beast. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk is not here to dance. It is here to kill. The first pass rips through your wingman's fuselage. Metal screams. Smoke trails black against the rising sun. You dive, certain you can outturn this American machine, but the Warhawk refuses to play by your rules. It dives harder, dives faster, with gravity itself as its weapon. The airframe shudders, but it holds. The Warhawk does not need to outclimb you. It does not need to pirouette. It simply drops like a hawk upon prey, claws of .50 caliber tearing apart the illusion of Japanese invincibility. Your confidence falters. Training told you to expect weakness, yet you face a predator that thrives in brutality, not elegance. Its pilots, those flying tigers with shark teeth and unpolished bravado, fight not with honor-bound formality, but with ruthless pragmatism. They strike from above, they vanish, they return again. Every encounter carves doubt into your certainty, like the teeth painted on their planes carving through your imagination. And so you ask yourself, how did a supposedly inferior aircraft come to command such fear? What was it about the Warhawk that made even disciplined Japanese aviators sweat beneath their helmets? Was it the raw speed in a dive, the armored cockpit, the heavy guns? Or was it something more intangible, a psychological weapon painted in the grin of a predator? This story is not simply about a machine. It is about perception, arrogance, and the harsh education of war. To understand the Warhawk, you must step into the boots of its enemy. You must see through Japanese eyes, through the overconfidence, the shock, the grudging respect. Stay with us as we unravel this forgotten duel of the skies. We will dive into the case studies of real dogfights, decode the technical mysteries of the P-40, and hear from diaries, reports, and voices that reveal how it felt to stare down the shark mouth of history. Because war is not only written in victories and defeats, it is painted in fear, pride, and the bitter taste of surprise. So buckle in. This is not just history. This is testimony, adrenaline, and a lesson in humility. And if you want more untold war stories dissected like never before, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next sortie. The first time the P-40 Warhawk appeared before Japanese pilots was not accompanied by trumpet or ceremony, but by disbelief. In the winter skies over China, they had been told that the enemy still flew relics, biplanes and outdated monoplanes, easy prey for the sleek Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero, with its long wings and whisper-light structure, had become the pride of the Imperial Navy. It could climb like no other, roll with fluid precision, and turn inside almost anything. Pilots were taught to believe in it as an extension of their own spirit. But one morning near Kunming, during an escort mission for bombers, that faith was tested. The formation was tight, the sky a pale canvas of high-altitude frost. Suddenly, a dark, shark-toothed silhouette cut through the clouds. At first glance, it looked clumsy, thick nose, heavy body, painted not with ceremonial markings but with savage teeth. A few pilots laughed over the radio, mocking the appearance. Yet the laughter stopped when the first burst of .50 caliber rounds laced across the bomber's flank. The Japanese pilot who recorded that encounter in his diary described confusion. He dove to engage, expecting the strange enemy machine to break under pressure. Instead, the P-40 pulled into a screaming dive, faster than the Zero dared to follow. The Japanese engine strained, the wings began to tremble, and the pilot had to pull back. Below, the Warhawk leveled out, climbed only slightly, then struck again, a hawk stooping upon sparrows. It was the beginning of an education in fear. In the days that followed, whispers spread among air groups, beware the shark mouth. Intelligence officers tried to reassure the pilots. They claimed the Curtiss machine was slower, heavier, poorly suited for close combat. On paper it was true. The Zero could outturn and outclimb the Warhawk with ease. But the battlefield is not paper, and the Warhawk pilots refused to fight on Japanese terms. A veteran lieutenant recalled an ambush over Rangoon in early 1942. His formation of Zeros dove on what they believed were vulnerable Allied fighters. But the Americans, flying the P-40 under the banner of the Flying Tigers, had studied Japanese habits. They attacked from the sun, diving straight through the formation and ripping apart the trailing aircraft before climbing just enough to reset. The lieutenant remembered the sound of tearing fabric and exploding fuel tanks, then the sudden silence of losing a comrade. Again and again the Warhawk's strategy was not elegance but brutality. It did not stay to duel. It struck, it killed, and it was gone. To Japanese pilots raised on the Bushido spirit, this felt dishonorable. Yet war cares nothing for honor, it only records results. And the results were undeniable. The P-40, supposedly obsolete, was holding its own. One Japanese intelligence briefing noted that the American machine could not sustain high-G maneuvers in a climb, but could dive at over 400 miles per hour without tearing its wings off. This fact, passed quietly through units, became a warning: never chase a shark mouth down. Still, in the heat of combat, instincts betrayed men. More than one Zero followed, only to feel their aircraft shudder apart, caught in speeds their engineers never designed for. In contrast, the Zero remained fragile. Its lack of armor, its unprotected fuel tanks, once seen as a fair trade for agility, became a curse when facing the Warhawk's heavy guns. Pilots who once trusted the Zero's wings to shield them began to feel naked in the sky. A single burst from a P-40 could ignite the cockpit or shred vital controls. Many never had a chance to parachute. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical. Warhawks seemed to appear out of nowhere, striking with jaws of fire. The shark mouth became not merely decoration but a phantom in the minds of Japanese pilots. A young ensign wrote in his letter home that he could not sleep without seeing the teeth grinning in the dark. And yet, despite the losses, pride remained. Many believed the Warhawk survived not through superiority but through cowardice, diving, running, refusing to fight properly. That belief was comforting, but each mission told another story. More bombers fell under the Warhawk's guns. More comrades vanished in smoke. Slowly, respect crept into the contempt. The clash between the Zero and the P-40 was more than a duel of machines. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of war, one built on maneuver and spirit, the other on resilience and pragmatism. The Japanese pilot in his elegant Zero learned that the sky no longer belonged to grace alone. It also belonged to brute force and to the predator's cunning. The campaign over Burma in early 1942 became a crucible where Japanese pilots confronted the full measure of the P-40's defiance. By then, whispers had become warnings, and warnings had hardened into doctrine. Do not fight the Warhawk on its terms. Yet in the chaos of aerial battle, doctrine often dissolved into instinct. One Japanese flight leader remembered vividly the approach over the Irrawaddy Valley. His squadron of Zeros escorted bombers tasked with striking Allied supply lines. The sky was deceptively calm, dotted with white clouds, the earth below a patchwork of jungle and river. Then, as if emerging from the jungle itself, came the predators, Curtiss P-40s, their noses painted with wide, leering shark teeth. The Flying Tigers had learned to stalk. Their commander, Claire Chennault, had drilled into them that Japanese planes were nimble but fragile, masters of the turn yet slaves to physics when forced into dives. Thus, the Warhawks attacked like hawks truly would, from altitude with sudden violence, never staying to duel. The Japanese pilot described the first moments: a shriek of engines, flashes of gunfire, the bomber ahead erupting into a fireball. He banked hard, pulling his Zero into a tight spiral, searching for the enemy. But the P-40s were not circling to meet him. They had already vanished, diving away at impossible speed, immune to the temptation of the turning fight. Moments later, they climbed back from another angle, tearing through the formation again. The Japanese formation faltered. He ordered his men to pursue, but as they dove, he saw the warning signs: buffeting wings, straining engines, the edge of destruction. The Warhawks dove deeper still, unafraid, using gravity as their ally. It was like trying to chase a stone plummeting from a cliff. In his post-battle report, he admitted grudging respect. They fight not with elegance but with cunning. They strike, they disappear, and they strike again. It is not the way of the samurai, but it is the way of survival. The P-40's reputation grew further in the defense of Rangoon. Japanese bomber formations, once accustomed to leisurely strikes, now braced themselves for the shark-mouthed ambush. On December mornings, the sky filled with roaring engines and tracer fire. Warhawks rose to meet them not as prey but as predators. A Japanese ensign recalled the first time he saw the shark mouth up close. His Zero had turned into firing position against one, but the P-40 pilot rolled sharply, diving with a ferocity that left the ensign momentarily frozen. He followed, straining to match the dive. Within seconds, the world blurred, controls stiffened, and he felt the frame of his Zero quiver as if it would tear itself apart. He had to pull away. Below, the Warhawk pulled level and roared off, untouchable. That night, he wrote simply in his logbook, "The Hawk dives. The Zero trembles." Yet not all encounters ended in Allied triumph. Japanese pilots, disciplined and experienced, adapted. They learned to lure P-40s into climbing contests where the Zero held the advantage, or to extend battles long enough to exhaust the heavier machine. Victories came but never cheaply. Every loss reminded them that underestimating the enemy was the deadliest mistake of all. When news of Pearl Harbor spread, many Japanese aviators celebrated, certain that the Empire's dominance was assured. Yet even in Hawaii, amidst flames and wreckage, the P-40 had left its mark. A handful of Warhawks scrambled during the attack, shooting down several Japanese aircraft despite being outnumbered and outflown. For the Japanese pilots who returned from that mission, the memory was disquieting. The shark mouth, even in its death throes, had bitten back. By the spring of 1942, intelligence briefings grew more urgent. Reports circulated about the Warhawk's strengths: armored cockpits protecting pilots, self-sealing fuel tanks preventing instant explosions, heavy firepower capable of shredding fragile Zeros. Technical comparisons were passed around like talismans, reminders of what to avoid and where to press the advantage. The lessons were bitter. A machine that seemed ungainly and outdated had become a symbol of resilience. The shark mouth mocked not only the pilots but the very doctrine of the Imperial Navy. Grace and maneuver were no longer enough. The Japanese flight leader wrote in a letter never meant for publication, "We thought we would rule the skies with beauty and spirit. But in the clouds of Burma we met something else. A predator that cared nothing for beauty, only for survival. It is a lesson written in fire upon the wings of my comrades." The duel between Zero and Warhawk was far from over. In coming months, the skies over China, Burma, and the Pacific would roar with more clashes, more experiments of steel and blood. Each fight added a chapter to the story, a dialogue between arrogance and adaptation, between pride and pragmatism. And through it all, the Japanese pilots came to know one truth: the shark mouth could not be ignored. By the summer of 1942, Japanese aviators were no longer strangers to the P-40 Warhawk. What began as surprise had matured into wary respect, but the clash of doctrines continued. Reports arriving from scattered fronts, Burma, the Philippines, even the frozen Aleutians, painted a picture of a fighter that refused to fade quietly into history. One Japanese intelligence officer compiled testimonies from survivors of the Aleutian campaign. The environment was unlike anything they had trained for: endless fog, bitter winds, and mountains hidden under veils of ice. Zeros that had danced with elegance in the Pacific sun suddenly seemed fragile in the northern gales. Yet the P-40, rugged and unpretentious, thrived. Its Allison engine grumbled against the cold but kept running, its frame shrugged off rough weather that would cripple lighter machines. A naval ensign recalled flying into a swirling cloud bank near Kiska. He expected a lonely patrol, but the mist suddenly split with the thunder of machine guns. A Warhawk burst through, jaws painted wide, its tracers chewing across his wing. He dove instinctively, but the American did not pursue with a turning fight. Instead, it vanished into the fog like a phantom. "It struck like an animal from the snow," he later told an intelligence debrief. Then it was gone, leaving only the sound of the wind. 4 pilots raced to worship maneuverability. This was infuriating. The Zero's wings, so responsive in clear skies, became treacherous in the Aleutian's gales. The P-40, though slower to climb, felt anchored, solid, a predator made for ambush. Many Japanese pilots admitted privately that they feared the environment itself as much as the shark mouth. The Warhawk's shadow stretched further south as well. In Darwin, northern Australia, Japanese squadrons struck deep to test the Allied defenses. There too the Curtiss fighters met them head-on. Darwin's defenders were few, but the P-40s fought with ferocity that surprised even the most seasoned raiders. A Japanese pilot who took part in those raids later confessed to his diary that the Australians flying the P-40 did not fight as expected. "They are not cautious," he wrote. "They charge with reckless teeth even when outnumbered. It is madness, and yet it unsettles us." One sortie ended with his squadron losing 2 Zeros to head-on passes, a tactic Japanese doctrine considered wasteful. But the Warhawks, with armored cockpits and heavy guns, emerged battered but alive. That asymmetry, the willingness to gamble lives shielded by steel, forced Japanese airmen to reconsider their own vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, far away across deserts they would never see, reports from German allies filtered back. The Warhawk, known as Tomahawk or Kitty Hawk in Commonwealth service, was dueling the Luftwaffe over North Africa. Japanese officers studied those accounts with uneasy interest. The same traits that frustrated them in Burma, the diving attacks, the rugged frame, were being praised by German aces who fought against British pilots. It was strange, unsettling even, to know that their European partners cursed the same shark mouth they had faced in Asia. Within Japanese mess halls, conversations turned grim. Some clung to the belief that the Zero's elegance still reigned supreme. Others, quietly, admitted that brute strength had its own poetry. A captain summarized it bitterly: "The Warhawk does not win through beauty. It wins by refusing to die." As months passed, more encounters sharpened the contrast. The Zero remained graceful, able to twist and turn in ways the P-40 could not dream. But that grace came at a cost: fragility. Every time a Zero ignited under .50 caliber fire, the imbalance was driven home. Each Warhawk, scarred and pockmarked, often limped home. Each Zero that caught fire was lost in moments. The psychological weight grew heavier. Japanese flyers began to speak of the shark mouth as if it carried a spirit of its own. Young trainees whispered that to see those teeth meant fate had already chosen. Veteran officers scolded them, reminding that fear was more deadly than bullets, but privately even they could not dismiss the image. By late 1942, the duel had become a lesson in adaptation. Japanese pilots who survived more than a handful of encounters learned to respect the Warhawk's dive, to anticipate its ambush, to avoid chasing it into suicidal speeds. Yet these lessons were written in blood, learned only after comrades fell. One lieutenant wrote a haunting line after returning from a mission over China: "We fly in machines of paper and silk dreams. They fly in beasts of iron jaws. We may dance higher, but when they fall upon us, dreams burn." The war was far from decided. But in cockpit after cockpit, across jungles, mountains, and deserts, the P-40 was teaching its lesson: arrogance kills. And through every clash, Japanese pilots discovered that the enemy they mocked as outdated could, in truth, carve scars upon an empire's pride. By late 1942 and into 1943, the legend of the shark mouth had already bitten deeply into the psyche of Japanese aviators. The early arrogance, that the Zero's unmatched maneuverability guaranteed supremacy, was crumbling under the weight of lived experience. Each battle with the P-40 wrote new lessons in smoke and steel. The skies above China bore witness to many of these encounters. In one fierce engagement near Hengyang, Japanese pilots escorting bombers were suddenly assaulted by a swarm of P-40s diving from high altitude. The shark mouths fell like thunderbolts, spitting fire into the bomber formation. A Zero flight leader recounted how his men broke formation to defend the bombers, only to be drawn into a nightmare. The Warhawks refused to circle and duel. They struck, then plummeted away, only to reappear moments later from a different quarter. It was a dance of shadows, orchestrated by speed and weight rather than grace. In his after-action report, the leader admitted something unthinkable months earlier: "We could not bring them to our battlefield. They chose their moments and denied us our skill. It is as if we chase ghosts and every chase costs us blood." By 1943, Allied intelligence was improving and Japanese pilots knew it. Warhawks often appeared exactly where bombers were most vulnerable, striking with unnerving precision. Rumors circulated that spies fed information to the Flying Tigers, or that radios were compromised. The truth was less exotic but more damning. Allied pilots had studied Japanese patterns and the P-40's tactics were built to exploit them. The Zero, for all its grace, could not change its nature. It remained fragile, built for offense, not survival. A Japanese ensign who survived a head-on clash with a P-40 near the Salween River returned shaken. His Zero bore holes across the fuselage. His comrade's machine had exploded instantly. "We carry the sword," he wrote, "but they carry the hammer. And in war the hammer strikes harder." Further south, in the skies above New Guinea, Japanese squadrons again met the Warhawk. This time the lesson was reinforced with brutal clarity. The jungle terrain meant ambushes were constant. P-40s lay in wait, diving from hidden altitude, shattering formations before vanishing. Japanese pilots complained that they never saw the enemy until the first shell struck. The shark mouth became synonymous with sudden death. Some tried to adapt. Veteran pilots advised their units to avoid diving contests, to force the Warhawk upward into climbs it could not sustain. There were successes. A few Warhawks, too eager in pursuit, stalled under the Zero's climbing spiral and fell prey. But the price of such victories was steep. For every careless P-40 lost, more Zeros burned in surprise attacks. One intelligence officer compiled the contrast into a single devastating note. "The Zero is a blade that shatters armor but breaks against stone. The Warhawk is the stone." The cumulative effect was psychological as much as tactical. Young Japanese pilots entering combat for the first time no longer saw the Warhawk as a relic to be mocked. They had heard too many stories of comrades consumed in its jaws. Some carried charms against the shark mouth, small talismans tucked into flight suits. Superstition, born from the gnawing truth that survival against the P-40 often came down to chance. By mid-1943, the tide of the wider war was turning. The Zero still scored victories, still claimed skies with its dance, but attrition was merciless. Allied industry replaced Warhawks faster than Japan could replace its pilots. And every new batch of Japanese airmen, green and untested, faced the same brutal lesson. One diary entry from a surviving officer captured the change of spirit. "We believed our wings were invincible, that our spirit alone would triumph. But the shark mouth has shown us otherwise. It teaches us that war is not won by beauty or courage. It is won by the machine that endures, by the pilot who refuses to play by our rules." The case studies of P-40 encounters, Burma's ambushes, Darwin's defiance, Aleutian phantoms, China's brutal duels, formed a tapestry of bitter education for Japanese pilots. The Curtiss Warhawk, dismissed at first as outdated, proved instead to be a weapon of psychological dominance. Its painted grin haunted dreams, its armored body defied fragile elegance, and its tactics mocked the very code of aerial honor the Zero embodied. By the end of 1943, the Japanese high command could no longer deny the truth. The P-40 was not the finest fighter of the war, but in its battles against the Zero it had revealed something deeper. It was a symbol of adaptation, of rugged survival, of pragmatism over pride. And in the memories of the men who faced it, the Warhawk remained not merely a machine but a ghost with teeth, carved forever into the clouds of war. When the Japanese pilots first took to the skies in the early 1940s, their world was shaped by confidence. Confidence in the aircraft they flew, confidence in the training they had received, and confidence in the destiny of the empire they served. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was more than a machine. It was a national icon, a sleek embodiment of Japanese engineering that seemed untouchable. Its agility and range had already astonished opponents in China and at Pearl Harbor. To sit in its cockpit was to feel chosen, elevated above the ordinary soldier. Yet the entry of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk into the battlefield challenged that narrative in ways the Japanese had not anticipated. What began as scattered encounters evolved into a consistent pattern, and the myth of invincibility began to crack. To understand why, we must step back and trace the context, the strategic landscape, the doctrines of air combat, and the assumptions both sides carried into the fight. Japan's doctrine leaned heavily on offensive spirit. Pilots were taught that courage and skill could overcome material disadvantage, that the purity of the dogfight, the turning contest, the duel of aces, was the natural arena of war in the sky. The Zero was designed for that doctrine. Lightweight, stripped of armor, with immense maneuverability. It was an aircraft built to trust in the hands of the warrior, not in the thickness of its skin. The United States and its allies approached the air war differently. Their philosophy was shaped by industrial capacity and hard pragmatism. The P-40 Warhawk was not the most advanced fighter of its time. In fact, by the outbreak of full-scale war, many considered it already a generation behind. But it carried qualities that mattered deeply in protracted combat: durability, firepower, and adaptability. It could dive without fear of tearing its wings apart, it could absorb punishment, and it could return home with scars that would have destroyed a Zero. This contrast reflected larger truths about the war. Japan had entered the conflict expecting swift campaigns, decisive victories that would shock adversaries into negotiation. The United States, once committed, prepared for a long, grinding struggle. The P-40 mirrored that mindset. It was not elegant, but it could endure. And endurance, as the Japanese pilots gradually learned, was a weapon of its own. The first problem for Japanese aviators was psychological. They had been told repeatedly that the enemy's equipment was obsolete, its pilots unskilled, its spirit weak. Early victories reinforced that belief. But each encounter with the P-40 undermined it, often in brutal ways. A squadron might return home missing 2 aircraft, each victim of a Warhawk's diving strike. A young pilot might see his mentor vanish in flames after underestimating a shark mouth. Confidence began to erode, replaced by unease. The second problem was tactical. Japanese squadrons, trained to press turning engagements, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to turn. The P-40 denied them the fight they wanted. It chose its moment, diving in with devastating firepower, then disappearing before the Zero could exploit its agility. The Japanese pilots called it dishonorable, but beneath the scorn lay frustration. Honor could not stop bullets. The third problem was strategic. As the war widened, Japanese units fought farther from home, often with thin logistical support. Every pilot lost, every Zero destroyed, was a blow the empire could not easily replace. The Americans, by contrast, had factories humming, shipping replacements across oceans. The P-40 was not only a machine, it was a symbol of industrial depth. For every Warhawk lost, another waited. For every pilot killed, another was training. Within this context, the Warhawk's effectiveness grew larger than its statistics. On paper, the Zero still outperformed it in speed of climb and turning radius. But on the battlefield, numbers were filtered through the lens of human fear, fatigue, and morale. The shark mouth painted on the nose became more than art. It became a psychological edge, a reminder that this inferior machine had claimed comrades and would claim more. Reports from Japanese intelligence began to reflect this tension. Early dismissals gave way to grudging acknowledgments. Officers warned against diving after P-40s, urged formations to stay disciplined, emphasized the need to adapt tactics. But adaptation is slow and the war moved quickly. For every squadron that learned restraint, another paid in blood for its first mistake. The broader issue lay in Japan's strategic underestimation of its enemies. The empire believed it could seize dominance swiftly, before American industry could respond. Yet by 1942 and 1943, the Warhawk was already a sign that this assumption was collapsing. The aircraft may not have been the most advanced, but it was available in numbers, flown by determined men, and backed by a system that learned and adjusted. The Japanese Air Force, stretched thin, found itself fighting not only against machines but against time, against attrition, against inevitability. For the pilots themselves, the problem was deeply personal. Each sortie meant stepping into a sky haunted by shark mouths, knowing that survival depended on avoiding the enemy's terms. The Zero still offered a chance for victory, but it demanded flawless skill, absolute discipline, and often luck. The Warhawk, by contrast, offered its pilots margin for error. That difference, between fragility and resilience, shaped every encounter. The context of these battles reveals more than technical comparisons. It exposes the clash of two mentalities, one rooted in tradition, valor, and elegance, the other in endurance, pragmatism, and adaptation. Japanese pilots, raised on the former, confronted the reality of the latter every time they saw a Warhawk rise into the sun. And in that confrontation lay the seeds of doubt that would grow throughout the war. The problem then was not only tactical or technical. It was existential. For the Japanese pilot facing the P-40 Warhawk was facing the possibility that the world was changing, that honor and spirit alone could not overcome steel jaws and industrial strength. It was a lesson written in every dive, every burst of tracers, every comrade lost to the grin of the shark mouth. Japanese intelligence reports, compiled from combat encounters and captured documents, painted a picture of the P-40 Warhawk that at first seemed unimpressive. On the surface, its statistics looked ordinary, even inferior. But numbers, when tested against fire and fear, carried meanings far sharper than charts could suggest. If the P-40 could dive at over 400 miles per hour without shedding its wings, then the Zero, light as silk, began to unravel above 350. It was as though one bird had bones of hollow bamboo, the other bones of iron. In every chase downward, the Warhawk became the hawk true to its name, folding its wings into the wind and letting gravity sharpen its talons. The Zero, delicate, was like a swallow. It could dart and twist, but if it followed the hawk into the abyss, its body would break before it could strike. If the P-40 carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each spitting heavy rounds with ruthless consistency, then the Zero, with its twin 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, was a duelist with a fine blade but fragile stamina. The cannons could kill quickly, yes, but their limited ammunition often left the Japanese pilot empty-handed after only a few bursts. The Warhawk's heavy guns, though less elegant, offered persistence, a hammer striking again and again, while the Zero's blade dulled too soon. If the P-40 had armor plating around its cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, then the Zero, stripped for agility, was naked. A Japanese pilot knew that a single burst could set his plane ablaze, the flames fed by unprotected tanks. Meanwhile, he could see the Warhawk absorb punishment, limping home scarred but alive. It was like thrusting a spear at a beast's hide only to find the skin too thick to pierce, while one arrow against your own flesh was fatal. The intelligence notes became grim reminders. Never engage a Warhawk in a dive, never try to outlast it in a slugging contest, never believe it would fall with a single strike. And yet, the Zero still had its arena. If the Warhawk could endure punishment, the Zero could dance around it. In a flat-turning fight, the Japanese fighter could spin inside the American machine with almost contemptuous ease. If the Warhawk was a hammer, the Zero was a rapier, swift, elegant, capable of piercing the gaps in its opponent's armor. Many victories were won this way, drawing the shark mouth into a circling duel where its bulk betrayed it. But the Warhawk's pilots, schooled by Claire Chennault and hardened by necessity, rarely allowed themselves to be baited. To the Japanese mind, this imbalance was infuriating. A duel should be fought with honor, yet the Warhawk fought like a street brawler, ducking, weaving, striking only when sure of the kill. If the Zero embodied the samurai's blade, the P-40 embodied the iron fist of an industrial soldier. Numbers underscored this metaphor. If the Zero weighed barely 5,500 pounds when loaded, then the P-40 carried nearly 8,000. If the Zero could climb at 3,000 feet per minute, then the Warhawk often struggled under 2,100. In the vertical ascent, the Zero seemed untouchable, soaring like a kite in the wind. But weight brought stability. In turbulence, in dives, in sudden shocks of battle, the P-40 held steady while the Zero trembled. The kite could dance, but the stone could strike. Japanese pilots quickly learned to measure battles in these terms. A Warhawk above was a predator. A Warhawk below was an opportunity. If it chose the dive, survival meant discipline. Hold formation, do not chase, endure the strike. If it lingered to climb, then unleash the Zero's wings, draw it into spirals where its heavy body faltered. But even when logic dictated caution, instinct often betrayed men. Many who had been raised to believe in the Zero's supremacy could not resist chasing the hawk downward, believing that spirit could overcome physics. Too often, those pursuits ended with shattered wings and vanished comrades. The metaphor that haunted many Japanese pilots was simple. If the Zero was the sword of the warrior, sharp and flawless, then the P-40 was the shield of the farmer, rough but unbreakable. And when the sword struck shield too many times, it was the sword that fractured first. Japanese pilots soon discovered that the clash between the Zero and the Warhawk was not merely about speed or climb, but about the essence of design philosophy. Intelligence reports circulated through squadrons, and each line carried both warning and bitter recognition. If the P-40's maximum speed was 360 miles per hour at medium altitude, then the Zero, with its lighter frame, could still outpace it in a climb to 20,000 feet. The Zero seemed to breathe the thin air more easily, like a falcon rising on warm currents, while the Warhawk labored upward like a heavy beast dragging its weight. But once the altitude was gained, the battlefield was no longer fair. A single nose-down dive turned that heaviness into a weapon. The Falcon could circle above, elegant and precise, but the Hawk could plunge like a falling stone, its mass turned into fury. If the P-40's armor and sealing made it resilient, then the Zero's fragility made it a paradox. For every encounter where a Zero slashed the Warhawk with its cannons, there were others where those same cannons ran dry, leaving the Japanese pilot defenseless as the Warhawk's 6 heavy guns spat fire without pause. To Japanese intelligence officers, the arithmetic was cruel: fewer rounds of devastating power against thousands of rounds of relentless hammering. The sword could cut deep, but the hammer kept swinging. And there was the engine. If the P-40's Allison V1710 was criticized for weak high-altitude performance, then the Zero's Sakai engine gave it breath where the American faltered. But this advantage was fragile, depending on conditions. In the choking air over Burma's jungles or the freezing Aleutians, the rugged Allison kept going, while the Zero's lighter build shivered. The Warhawk was not a thoroughbred racehorse but a plow horse. It pulled through mud, snow, and storm, not gracefully but without dying. Pilots began to voice these metaphors in their diaries. One compared the Zero to a willow tree, bending and swaying, cutting with graceful arcs. The Warhawk, he wrote, was a block of oak. It did not bend, it did not dance, but it endured every storm. And in the end, the storm belonged not to the willow but to the oak. Japanese intelligence emphasized one golden rule: force the Warhawk to climb, never to dive. If you could lure it into spirals, it would falter. If you allowed it to dive, you were already condemned. Pilots tried to follow this, but combat rarely allowed perfect obedience. In the chaos of tracers and explosions, instinct pulled many into the fatal chase downward. And so the technical truth became psychological truth. The Warhawk was not faster, not more elegant, not even more advanced. Yet it had qualities that gnawed at the Japanese soul. It refused to die, it punished recklessness, and it punished arrogance. If the Zero was the embodiment of Japan's faith in spirit over steel, then the Warhawk was the embodiment of America's faith in resilience, numbers, and pragmatism. This contrast was perhaps clearest in one overlooked statistic. If the Zero's empty weight was barely over 3,000 kilograms, then the Warhawk stood closer to 4,000. To the Japanese, this heaviness looked like a flaw. But in practice, that weight meant sturdiness, the ability to dive without shattering, the strength to carry armor and heavy guns. What seemed a disadvantage on paper became a weapon in the sky. The metaphor often used among frustrated pilots was simple. If you strike a porcelain vase against a rough stone, the vase may gleam brighter, but it is the vase that will shatter. The Zero, delicate and deadly, was the vase. The Warhawk, crude and unadorned, was the stone. By 1943, Japanese intelligence no longer dismissed the P-40 as outdated. They acknowledged its strengths plainly: formidable in the dive, resilient under fire, deadly in its persistence. The reports carried one final line, repeated in different forms across multiple memos: do not underestimate the shark mouth. The lesson was no longer academic. It was etched into the memories of pilots who returned alone, into the absence of comrades whose planes never came back. The Warhawk had proven that war was not about who danced best in the sky, but who could still fight after the storm. The duel between the Zero and the P-40 Warhawk was never just about two machines, it was about two philosophies colliding in the unforgiving laboratory of war. The Japanese approach, steeped in tradition and confidence, believed the finest sword would always triumph. The American approach, forged in industry and pragmatism, trusted that resilience would wear down elegance. In the smoke of aerial battle, these ideas clashed, and the cracks in Japanese doctrine became clear. If the Zero was built to embody agility and range, then the Warhawk was built to survive punishment. Japanese engineers stripped weight, sacrificing armor and fuel protection, believing maneuverability was the ultimate defense. At first, this seemed vindicated. The Zero danced rings around Chinese fighters, embarrassed Allied machines over Malaya and the Philippines, and even stunned Americans at Pearl Harbor. But the Warhawk forced a new reality. Armor meant that bullets sometimes bounced. Sealed tanks meant that hits did not always become infernos. If the P-40 absorbed a burst and still returned to fight, then the Zero, struck once, often disappeared in flames. The first Japanese mistake lay in underestimation. Before encountering the shark mouth, briefings dismissed the Curtiss fighter as obsolete. Its weight, its climb rate, its limited high-altitude performance, all cited as weaknesses. But those very flaws became irrelevant in the environment where it fought best: low to medium altitudes over China, Burma, and the islands. Japanese pilots entered battle expecting weak prey and instead faced a predator. Confidence turned into shock and shock into casualties. The second mistake was doctrinal arrogance. Japanese training emphasized the turn fight, the duel of skill. But the Warhawk refused to duel. It fought on its own terms, diving with fury, striking with brute force, and vanishing before the Zero could exploit its grace. Japanese pilots often called this cowardice, but in truth, it was adaptation. If the P-40 avoided the Zero's strengths, then the Zero was forced into battles it did not want. It was a clash between idealism and realism drew blood. A third mistake was the assumption of endless superiority. Early victories lulled Japanese command into believing that spirit and training could compensate for material disadvantage. Yet in every clash with the P-40, the imbalance of endurance was clear. If the Zero outturned, the Warhawk outlasted. If the Zero struck once, the Warhawk struck 10 times. And crucially, if a Zero pilot perished, his loss was irreplaceable. The Americans, supported by industry, trained more, produced more, and filled gaps the Japanese could not. Each Warhawk lost was a wound, each Zero lost was an amputation. Pilots themselves saw these truths in the cockpit. Diaries described the frustration of shredding a Warhawk with cannon fire, only to see it limp home, while comrades exploded from a single .50 caliber burst. They compared the fight to wrestling with a bear. Agile attacks might sting, but one heavy paw could end it. The metaphor became bitter. We are the swordsman, but the bear does not care for swords. The final mistake was psychological blindness. The painted shark mouth, intended as intimidation, worked better than expected. Japanese pilots began to associate the image with ambush, loss, and sudden death. Even veterans felt the gnawing dread. Young recruits, told to believe in the Zero's supremacy, entered combat already haunted by rumors of the Warhawk's bite. Fear corrodes discipline, and in the cockpit hesitation kills. If the Zero was Japan's blade of legend, the Warhawk was America's hammer of industry. The sword could cut quickly, but the hammer could shatter bone with each strike. And when swords clashed with hammers long enough, it was not the hammer that broke. The lessons became unavoidable. To underestimate an enemy is to sharpen his blade with your pride. The Japanese believed they had mastered the air with grace and spirit. The P-40 taught them that survival, not elegance, ruled the sky. The tragedy is that these lessons were written too late, after too many were lost. Thus the comparison is stark. If the Zero excelled in the duel, the P-40 excelled in the hunt. If the Zero carried the spirit of the samurai, the P-40 carried the persistence of a machine that refused to quit. The Japanese mistake was not simply technical, it was cultural, a refusal to believe that the rough, heavy, graceless Warhawk could shatter the myth of invincibility. The encounters between Japanese pilots and the P-40 Warhawk left scars that went far beyond the battlefield. They were not just dogfights in the clouds. They were lessons in humility, revelations that challenged deeply held beliefs, and turning points that shaped the course of aerial warfare. For the men who strapped themselves into Zeros and confronted the shark mouth, the consequences were felt in their tactics, their morale, and their memories long after the battles ended. The first and most immediate consequence was psychological. Early war victories had convinced Japanese aviators that they were untouchable. The Zero's dominance in the skies seemed proof of national superiority. But every clash with the P-40 chipped away at this certainty. When the Warhawk refused to fall, when it absorbed punishment and still fought back, Japanese pilots began to doubt. And in air combat, doubt was lethal. If the Zero had once inspired confidence like a sword carried by a warrior, then the Warhawk reminded them that even the finest blade could shatter against iron. For many, this was the first time they realized the war would not be swift or simple. Diaries reveal a progression, from mocking the Warhawk as outdated, to fearing its ambushes, to finally respecting it as a worthy foe. The painted shark mouth became a symbol of inevitability. Pilots joked about it to hide their unease, but privately they confessed to sleepless nights haunted by its grin. In this way, the P-40 shaped not just battles but the emotional landscape of the Japanese Air Force. The second consequence lay in tactics. The encounters forced Japanese units to adapt. Orders were issued: do not dive after Warhawks, do not let them dictate the fight. Zeros were instructed to stay in disciplined formations, to use altitude carefully, to exploit their climb and turn advantages without succumbing to reckless pursuit. But adapting a doctrine built on agility and spirit was not simple. Many pilots, especially younger ones, clung to instinct and pride, believing their skill could overcome physics. Too often they paid with their lives. This shift in tactics also exposed the limits of Japanese aircraft design. The Zero, with its unmatched maneuverability, was never meant to withstand sustained punishment. Against early war opponents this mattered little. Against the Warhawk, with its heavy guns and armor, fragility became fatal. Japanese engineers were slow to address these weaknesses, and by the time sturdier successors arrived, the tide of the war had already turned. The P-40 had shown that resilience was as much a weapon as speed. Strategically, the Warhawk also signaled a larger truth. Japan could not win a war of attrition. Each Zero lost was a skilled pilot gone, irreplaceable in a nation with limited resources. Each Warhawk lost was quickly replaced by American industry. Japanese pilots recognized this imbalance in grim conversations. They fought as if each mission might be their last, while their enemies fought knowing reinforcements were always on the horizon. The Warhawk, rugged and mass-produced, embodied this difference. It was a machine born not of perfection but of numbers, and numbers were what Japan could not match. There was also a cultural consequence. The Japanese ideal of aerial combat as a duel of warriors, a place for skill and spirit, crumbled under the Warhawk's tactics. The P-40 fought pragmatically, diving, striking, vanishing, refusing to give the Zero its elegant duel. This was seen at first as dishonorable, but over time it forced Japanese pilots to question their own ideals. Was war about honor or about survival? Could beauty in combat matter if it led only to defeat? These questions lingered in the minds of survivors long after the war, shaping their reflections in memoirs and interviews. On the Allied side, the Warhawk's legacy was equally significant. Though often overshadowed by later fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the F-6F Hellcat, the P-40 played a crucial role in the early years. It bought time. It bloodied Japanese units at a moment when the Allies were still recovering from defeat. It gave hope to defenders in China, Burma, and Australia. And it taught Allied pilots the value of exploiting strengths and denying weaknesses, a philosophy that carried into the design and use of later aircraft. For Japanese veterans, the memory of the P-40 lingered in paradox. They had once despised it, then feared it, then respected it. After the war, many spoke of the shark mouth not as an inferior machine but as an equal adversary. Some even admitted that facing the Warhawk taught them lessons they carried into civilian life. Never underestimate what looks ordinary, never dismiss resilience. One veteran compared it to a farmer's ox, clumsy, perhaps, but unstoppable once it lowered its head. The long-term consequence for history was the collapse of the myth of Japanese invincibility. The Zero remained a symbol, but the Warhawk proved it could be beaten. This psychological shift, small in each individual battle, became massive in aggregate. Allied pilots no longer feared the Zero as they once had. Japanese pilots no longer trusted it as absolutely as before. The aura cracked, and once it cracked, it could never be restored. The Warhawk's influence stretched even into post-war aviation theory. Military analysts pointed to its service as proof that survivability mattered as much as performance. A fighter that could take damage and return home was more valuable in a long war than one that could only win by never being hit. This principle shaped future generations of aircraft, where armor, self-sealing tanks, and heavy firepower became standard. And perhaps the deepest consequence was human. The young men who climbed into Zeros in 1941 believed they would fly as heroes of an invincible empire. By 1943, many knew they were flying into storms they might not survive. The Warhawk, with its shark grin, was part of that storm. It humbled them. It reminded them that war was not a duel of knights but a struggle of endurance, where survival favored the strong and the stubborn. In the end, the P-40 Warhawk was not the best fighter of the war, nor the most glamorous. But for the Japanese pilots who faced it, it became a teacher. It taught them that arrogance kills, that resilience wins, and that even the sharpest sword may break against a hammer. Its legacy was not written only in victories, but in the lessons carved into the hearts of those who once laughed at its appearance, only to weep at its bite. The sky remembers everything. It remembers the arcs of tracer fire, the trails of smoke, the sudden silence where an engine once roared. It remembers, too, the lessons that pilots carried in their hearts, written not in textbooks but in the moments between life and death. The story of the Zero and the Warhawk is one such memory, etched into the clouds, heavy with meaning. For the Japanese pilot, the P-40 Warhawk was not supposed to matter. It was painted as an obsolete relic, a stopgap fighter unworthy of fear. And yet, in the crucible of battle, it became a predator. Its dive was a blade of gravity. Its armor was the shell of a stubborn beast. Its shark mouth was more than paint, it was prophecy. Each time it appeared, illusions shattered and reality forced its way in. The lesson is simple but brutal. Never underestimate an enemy. The Zero was fast, agile, elegant, an acrobat with wings. But war does not reward elegance alone. The Warhawk showed that endurance, resilience, and cunning could defeat grace. It reminded us that machines are not judged by how they look in a hangar, but how they bleed and bite when the world is on fire. Beyond machines, the story is about men. Young aviators who believed they flew invincible wings found themselves humbled by a rugged fighter with painted teeth. They learned, too late, that arrogance is as deadly as bullets. The Warhawk was not the most advanced aircraft of the war, but it was a mirror, forcing the Japanese to see their own vulnerabilities. And for us, today the story offers more than history, it offers perspective. Pride, unchecked, blinds us. Confidence, untested, betrays us. The Warhawk's true power was not in its guns or its dives, but in the lesson it carved into those who faced it. Survival belongs not to the most graceful, but to the most adaptable. So when you look at old photographs of those shark-toothed fighters lined up on dusty runways, see more than machines. See the story of how underestimation turned to fear, how arrogance turned to ashes, how resilience wrote its name across the sky. This is not just history, it is warning. The Warhawk's teeth still grin across time, daring us to remember. If you found this journey through the eyes of the enemy as haunting and revealing as I did, stay with us. More forgotten duels, more untold truths, more voices from the past are waiting. Subscribe, share this story, and join me as we dive again into the skies of history. The next lesson is already circling above, waiting to strike.